So we're continuing tonight with our study of Jerusalem, and in particular the times that Jerusalem has been besieged and fallen. And tonight we probably come to perhaps the most famous fall of Jerusalem, and that is the fall to Rome in 70 A.D. Again, the fall to Babylon in 586 was very thorough and again very famous. And yet this one probably is the most famous of all, and not in small part due to the fact that Jesus himself prophesies the fall of Jerusalem. So we're going to look at a passage from the Olivet Discourse, and this is found also in Mark's Gospel and also in Matthew's Gospel, where Jesus is outside the temple, and they're talking about the temple itself, and Jesus tells them that the temple is not going to last. And he talks to them about what's going to be happening at the end of time. And he starts in he doesn't start, but I want to pick up the conversation in verse 20. But when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then recognize that her desolation is near. Then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains, and those who are in the midst of the city must leave, and those who are in the country must not enter the city, because these are days of vengeance, so that all the things which are written will be fulfilled. Woe to those who are pregnant and to those who are nursing babies in those days, for there will be great distress upon the land and wrath to this people. And they will fall by the edge of the sword and will be led captive into the nations, into all the nations, and Jerusalem will be trampled underfoot by the Gentiles until the time of the Gentiles is fulfilled. So to begin tonight with a quote from Martin Goodman's book, Rome and Jerusalem, he says, the description of the ensuing mayhem, the mayhem that Jesus describes here, written just a few years later by Josephus, is chilling. He says the troops not only plundered the quarter, now this is just before the battle, this is about 4 years before the fall of Jerusalem, but this is a harbinger of what's to come. They not only plundered the quarter which they are sent to attack, but plunged into every house and slaughtered the inmates. There followed a stampede through narrow alleys, massacre of all who were caught, every variety of pillage. The total number of that day's victims, including women and children, for they did not even abstain from infants, amounted to about 3,600. It was the beginning of a cycle of increasing violence that would end just over 4 years later in the destruction of the whole city. Now, if this were a course on eschatology, that is the end of time, we could have a discussion tonight about preterism, about how much of biblical prophecy is fulfilled in the fall of Jerusalem in 70 A.D. This is another reason why I believe that this is the most famous fall of Jerusalem in the history of the city. But Jesus is certainly describing the horrible events that are going to take place around Jerusalem, not thousands of years later or whenever the second coming might be, but no, in just a few decades when Jerusalem will fall to the Romans in 70 A.D. Now in our study tonight we're going to be looking at the 4 acts that lead to the complete destruction of Jerusalem. Now, really it's described in 4 characters, but I'm going to call it acts because it happens sequentially, and some of it, when we look at the Jewish rebels, some of it has been gathering momentum, and we're just kind of look at how it had gone to seed, so to speak, at that time. But also we're going to see the events that lead up to the destruction of the city in 70 A.D. The first person that we're going to start with is a Roman governor. He's the governor of Syria, and remember that Judea and Jerusalem are under the Syrian province, and his name is Gessius Florus. In 66 A.D., some of the population in Jerusalem, the Jewish population there, shouted abuses at this governor because he had ordered his troops into the city, and again, they were carrying their weapons, and the people were supposed to go out into the streets and watch them. It was a symbolic gesture to humiliate the Jewish people, and they understood that. And so as the soldiers came into the city, the citizens began to shout harsh things at the governor and throw things. And so the governor, in response, Florus orders, and this is what we're reading about from Martin Goodman's book in the description that I read to you at the beginning of this lesson tonight. The governor sent his troops into the market of Jerusalem to retaliate for this insult to him. And in the ensuing retaliation, his troops murder, as we see here in Josephus's account, about 3,600 men, women, and children in Jerusalem, people who were butchered by soldiers under the authority of Florus. About 2 months later, the Jewish rebels, now in retaliation against this massacre, besieged a Roman cohort. A cohort consists of about 600 men at the fortress of Antonia. The rebels forced the Roman soldiers to accept a treaty so that they would lay down their weapons. They were going to allow the Romans safe passage if they would lay down their arms and leave the city. Well, the Romans kept their part of the bargain. They laid down their weapons, and as they were leaving the city, the Jewish rebels fell upon them and murdered them. And the Roman soldiers, it said, did not ask for pity, did not ask for anything. They just kept saying, "Remember the oath, the oath, the oath." And the rebels ignored the oath. Only one Roman, and that was the commander, Metilius, survived. And he survived because he told the Jews that he would become a Jewish proselyte, that he would even be circumcised and all of that. And so they spared his life, and eventually he went back to the governor and told the governor everything that had happened. Well, the Romans were still willing to make peace with the rebels, and so Agrippa sends 2 emissaries to negotiate with the rebels in Jerusalem. Remember, this is Agrippa II, and Agrippa II is the last of the Herodian kings of Jerusalem, of Judea, in fact. And so Agrippa is solidly on the Roman side. He sympathizes with Rome. He knows that if Israel fights against Rome, that they're going to be destroyed. Something that the rebels have just not figured out. And so when he sends his agents to meet with the rebels, the rebels treat them roughly, and in fact they kill one of them, and the other escapes barely with his life. And so the new governor, Caesius, is forced to march on Jerusalem. His attack on the city was very successful. He brought a fairly large group, I think it was about 2 legions, and probably 10,000 men. And they fought their way to the city. They undermined the walls of the city, even the temple. And just as they were about to have complete victory, Caesius stops the battle. And no one really knows why. He dies about a year later of some disease. It was very bad, and some think, well, maybe this is what the reason he left. Others think that he was bribed by the Jews. Some think that he just said, well, I've made my point. If he's thinking that, he does not know these Jewish rebels very well, does he? And so for whatever reason, he withdraws, and he's withdrawing, and he has an army, and they're carrying shields and armor, and they have the assault equipment that they've assaulted walls with, the catapults and the rams and all these things that they're carrying. And as they enter into the wilderness, the Jewish rebels, who are fighting guerrilla warfare, and they're lightly armed, but they're very effective, and so they pick the Romans off, and the Romans, their orderly march back to Antioch becomes a rout, and about 5,000 Roman soldiers are killed. It kind of reminds you of what happened to the Romans. What's the name of the forest in Germany? Anybody remember? It starts with a T. The Germans murdered the Romans in a decisive battle. It was the Battle of something forest. It starts with a T. I can't remember. But anyway, it's the same kind of thing that happens here. And so this time the Romans, of course, cannot overlook this. And they're going to have to deal with these Jews. So the second act really becomes the beginning of what's going to happen. But I wanted you to see, again, the Jewish factions that are not only in Jerusalem, but in the surrounding area, but mainly in Jerusalem. And the first group that I mentioned are the moderates. The moderates were led by King Agrippa. We've said this before, but most of the wealthy people in Jerusalem were moderates. And of the two sects that are in Jerusalem, the Sadducees and the Pharisees, which one has the most money? Which one is the priestly class? The Sadducees. And so these people are trying to speak sensibly to the zealots and the rebels, to tell them that we can't fight Rome. We will never escape Rome. We will never be able to overthrow Roman rule here. If you rebel against them, it's just going to result in utter destruction. In fact, when these 5,000 men are killed, the moderates were weeping in the streets of Jerusalem because they knew that Rome would never overlook this. Again, the priestly families were in the moderate camp, and one of these families, one of these guys that's in that moderate camp, is murdered by the zealots. A priest by the name of Ananias. Remember him? He's in the Bible at the trial of Jesus. Also, Annas' son is involved in the moderate camp, and he too will be murdered. Now, that's not to say that every priest was a moderate. The priests led by Eleazar are going to be radical rebels, but not to the extent of some of the Idumeans and the other zealots. So the zealots these rebels are comprised of Idumeans. There are some foreigners, some Galileans, some people from other countries who have come back to Israel, and again, many are natives of Jerusalem. Remember, there was one of the disciples that was called a zealot. Was his name Judas too? Which one was called the zealot? I think it was Judas. I don't remember. Is one of them. Now, here's a historical note, and somebody asked about this, I think, last week. At this time, when these groups are starting to ramp up their resistance against Rome, many Christians left the city. It seems that they had heeded the words of Christ. One secular author said they had an oracle. I think the oracle is what Jesus says in Luke 21 and in the Olivet Discourse. That when you see these things start to happen, when you see nation against nation, and you see the Romans coming, it's time to get out. And it certainly was time to get out. So many of the Christians did, and they wound up in the Transjordan in a city called Pella. The leadership fell into the hands of three major players: John of Giscala, Eleazar is a priest, and Simon of Gyros, and that's actually, he's the son of Gyros. For a long time, they fought among themselves. They fought the moderates, they fought against themselves. And according to Josephus, and again, Josephus is biased in this, but he says their conduct was much worse than the Romans. You have the quote here, actually two quotes. With an insatiable lust for loot, they ransacked the houses of the wealthy. This isn't the Romans. This is the rebels. The murder of men and violation of women were their sport. They caroused on their spoils with blood to wash them down. And from their satiety, unscrupulously indulged in effeminate practices, plaiting their hair and attiring themselves in women's apparel, drenching themselves with perfumes and painting their eyelids to enhance their beauty. And not only did they initiate or imitate the dress, but also the passions of women, devising in their excesses of lasciviousness unlawful pleasures and wallowing as in the brothel in the city, which they polluted from end to end with their foul deeds. Yet while they wore women's faces, Their hands were murderous, and approaching with mincing steps, they would suddenly become warriors, and whipping out their swords from under their dyed mantles, transfix whomsoever they met. Can you imagine meeting some person who's transgender and they're dressed up like a woman and all the makeup and all the rest, and then as you meet them, all of a sudden they pull a sword out and assault you with it? That would be unexpected, wouldn't you say? But had become prevalent in Jerusalem. And then one only, this is about John that I mentioned, and one of the leaders, Josephus says of John, he not only put to death all those who proposed just and salutary measures, treating such persons as his bitterest enemies among all the citizens, but also in his public capacity loaded his country with evils innumerable, such as one might expect one would be inflicted upon men who had already dared to practice impiety, even towards God. Again, there was Simon the son of Joras. What crime did he not commit? Or what outrage did he refrain from inflicting upon the persons of those very free men who had created him a despot? Yet even their infatuation was outdone by the madness of the Idumeans. For those most abominable wretches, after butchering the chief priests, left no particle of religious worship might continue, proceeded to extirpate whatever relics were left of our civil polity, introducing into every department perfect lawlessness. In this the so-called zealots excelled, a class which justified their names by their actions, for they copied every deed of ill, nor was there any previous villainy recorded in history that they failed zealously to emulate. And yet they took their title from the professed zeal for virtue, either in mockery of those they wronged, so brutal was their nature, or reckoning the greatest of evils good. Accordingly, these each found a fitting end, God awarding due retribution to them all. So here's the deal, and this is the way people are, isn't it? So the rebels thought that God was on their side because they were against the Romans. The moderates and Roman sympathizers thought that God was against them because they were lawless and immoral. And so both sides, just like two football teams, they go out there and both of them are doing the signs and pointing up and all this, and both teams are doing that, So whose side is God on? Neither. God is always on God's side. But they're doing this in the name of religious zeal and affection, and yet they're evil. They're so evil they call good evil and evil good. Now, despite the strife between the factions, the Jews did have some semblance of independence, and we're going to look at the reason for that in just a moment. They were not politically attuned to what's going on in Rome. They thought somehow because the Romans had all of a sudden left them alone. So during these years, from sometime in 67 through late 69, the Romans don't bother them. The Romans actually withdraw. They become very quiet. And these Jewish rebels think, well, we've scared the Romans off. They're afraid of us. God is on our side. Little did they understand, and had they had any political acumen whatsoever, they would have known what was going on in Rome. But they didn't care. They had no political or geopolitical self-awareness. So they're vulnerable. But during this time when the Romans have withdrawn, they're living as if they're independent. Now, they call themselves Israel. They do not want to be called Judea because the Romans and the Persians had given them that name. Remember, the Jew came from Yehud. So they call themselves Israelite. They printed their own money. The inscriptions on the coins and the writings, which were later discovered, celebrated Israel's independence, proclaimed the temple as their symbol of power, and their inscriptions read, freedom and and holiness and all these things. The coins, our coins have the date in which they're minted. Their coins also have the dates, and they were dated like this: year 1 of freedom, year 2 of freedom, year 3 of freedom. So they're quite independent, and they're quite deceived because they think that something that is existing is going to continue. Little did they know that Rome had been diverted by internal political intrigue. And once that is settled, then Jerusalem will be dealt with. So that brings us to the next act in the whole unfolding of the tragedy of the fall of Jerusalem, and that is Nero and Vespasian. Titus Flavius Vespasianus. He was a hero in the wars of Britain 20 years before. In 67 A.D., he was given an army to destroy Jerusalem with by Nero. He was commissioned by Nero to attack Jerusalem and to destroy it. Along with his son Titus, who brought a legion from Alexandria, Egypt, he began the conquest of Israel. And what he did was, sound military strategy. He marched from the east, from the west and from the south, and then from the north, and he began to build a ring around Jerusalem to cut them off. And he was taking the small villages and the small towns, and they were being put to the sword. And many of them were escaping to Jerusalem and began to report in Jerusalem that the Romans indeed were coming and what they were doing. And so the Jewish leaders at this time, because they hear the Romans are coming, all of a sudden they get serious about the defense of the city. And the three of them come together, the three leaders, and they decide that Simon is going to be the commander-in-chief. Eleazar is going to be the one who is going to be defending the temple, and John is defending another portion of the city. I think perhaps the fortress or the north wall. But anyway, they divide the city up, and they begin to get ready for the defense of Jerusalem. And they're going to put on an able defense, but there's no way they're going to win. It would have had to have been like when Sennacherib, the Assyrian, invaded and was going to destroy Jerusalem. Remember what happened to him? His army was destroyed by a plague sent from God. That's the only way the Romans are going to lose. Otherwise, they are going to win. Maybe the Jews felt like, the Ukrainians. They weren't so afraid of the big bad bear, but in this case, the big bad bear really was an overwhelming enemy, more than advertised. So they're preparing. Vespasian is attacking the outlying regions. He's cutting off Jerusalem, and then as he zeroes in on the city, in June of 68 A.D., Nero dies, most likely suicide or murder. Vespasian stops the assault for two reasons. One, Nero's dead, and who commissioned him to capture Jerusalem? Nero did. So he doesn't have a clear command anymore. And secondly, there's intrigue back in Rome. There's the era of the three emperors that last, for just less than 2 years. And remember last week the Julio Claudio house of Rome, that group of leaders, which starts with Octavian, it ends with Nero, and so now we're in transition to the next line of emperors, which there'll never be a line like there was in the Julio Claudio line. So, in short order, emperors come and go, and finally, the army of Titus declares him to be the emperor, and they're willing to install him in force. And so the Senate concurs, and Vespasius becomes Vespasian, the new emperor of Rome. his attention immediately falls back to Jerusalem. Now this time he's not going himself. He's going to send his son, who's already been in the campaign. He's given an additional legion. There's now 4 legions. And so Jerusalem is going to be attacked by Titus, and he takes up the engagement again in the latter part of 69 A.D. So now the stage is set for the fall of Jerusalem. Again, as word comes back to Jerusalem of Rome's re-engagement, the command falls to Simon, the son of Gioras, and as they make preparations, they can't really foresee how fast the Romans move to Jerusalem. In fact, their advance is so swift and so unexpected that at Passover that year, remember Passover is in the spring, somewhere on our calendar around April, it must have been April that year, or late March. Thousands of people had gone on pilgrimage to Jerusalem for the Passover. And Titus arrives in time to capture or to prevent those people from leaving Jerusalem. And he doesn't let anybody leave. Immediately, and this kind of goes into the prophecy of Jesus, he begins to build walls and trenches around Jerusalem. So the first thing you're going to do before you besiege the city is make sure that no one from the city is going to leave. Cuts off anybody from going out, and what else would that do? That would cut off anything from going in. Famine spreads through the city. There are descriptions about this from Josephus that are blood-curdling. One of the worst, perhaps, is Mary, who was the daughter of Eleazar. She had fled to Jerusalem just before the siege, thinking that there might be safety in Jerusalem, but there was not. Remember what Jesus said about those who would be nursing their infants? Woe to them. Mary took her own nursing infant and killed it and roasted it. And she was going to save part of it to eat another time, but the smell of the corpse cooking drew others there. And it was carnage. Agrippa II tries to talk the rebels because Titus, even at the last hour, and even when he's inside the city walls, tells the rebels that if they will lay down their weapons and renounce their intentions to go against Rome, that he will allow them to go in peace. He gives them 2 opportunities. Agrippa II speaks to them. Josephus goes around the walls, and he describes it like this. He goes around the walls out of the range of their missiles. Their missiles being spears and arrows. But not so that they could not shout obscenities at him and throw refuse at him. But he tells them, surrender. The Romans are going to give you safe conduct. Surrender now, or you're going to be destroyed. But they refuse. So Titus tightens the ring, builds the ramparts. On one occasion, the Jews undermined one of them, set it fire, and they said wood was very scarce at that time, so it took him a couple of weeks to rebuild that, but he rebuilds 4. He breaches the outer walls, and then he attacks the temple itself and the fortress of Antonia. And remember, we only know about the fortress of Antonia from what we're told because it's going to be completely destroyed. Once again, he offers the Jews peace settlement. Once again, they refuse, and they're very treacherous in killing some of his soldiers, which is a pattern for them. And at first, and I don't know how this went between he and his father, but at first he was going to spare the temple. He wanted to spare the temple, but now he says all bets are off. And so he goes into the temple, And you know, the temple of Herod, you've seen the pictures, it's huge. It has the storage buildings around the side of it. It has this huge wall, the inner court, even the temple itself. And the rebels are at every place, and it's street to street. It's compartment to compartment. And finally, they're so tired. The Romans are so relentless that what few are left surrender, and they are executed. So the fortress of Antonia is taken, the temple is taken, and the battle of Jerusalem is over. And carnage ensues because the Roman soldiers want revenge for the resistance and for the treachery and the resistance and all the rest and for all that they put up with the Jews for the last 4 years. And so they take revenge. It's interesting that the last attack begins on the day the temple was destroyed in 586 by the Babylonians. There was something else that just came to mind that I wanted to tell you about this. My. Maybe it'll come again. Who knows? But anyway, the Romans, when Titus decides to destroy the temple, he doesn't have excavators and wrecking balls. He has to build towers. He has to build machinery to destroy the temple. I mean, he goes to a great deal of trouble to destroy the temple. And the destruction is completed in August of 70 AD. One thing I was going to tell you, another reason, and the Romans tried to honor the temples of other people, but one of the things that the rebels did when they took over the temple after they had murdered Ananias, the high priest, and the son of Annas, one of the things they did was they refused to let Gentiles, especially Romans, offer sacrifices at the temple. And the Romans are insulted because they had done that. And in their way, it was them honoring the Jewish religion while at the same time, being pious themselves. And so again, the Jewish rebels have so incensed and so insulted and so dealt so treacherously with the Romans through the years, and especially the last 4 years from Florus through the end in 70 AD. And remember I told you Josephus, he ends the antiquities of the Jews when Florus comes to power. He starts the Jewish wars with Florus. That's where the depiction of the Jewish wars begins. Ed, Trell asked me a question last week, and I forgot to look it up, but she asked me, when does the antiquities begin? What part of Jewish history? And I did not look it up. Does anybody know that? I've got to look that up. When antiquities begins. But anyway, that's a very good question. But the pivot between antiquities and the Jewish wars is the reign of Florus. And you ask, okay, why were the Jews so rebellious? And again, the answer is very difficult. And Martin Goodman, his work on Rome and Jerusalem is very good work because he explains the culture of the two cities after he talks about the destruction of Jerusalem. But I think in the end, it is the judgment of God. It is the judgment of God. And their lack of self-awareness, I think all of this comes because they're spiritually hardened. That is a very tough thing to say, but it's what Jesus is saying. If you go on with what Jesus said, now I'm not going to get into the second coming and all of that, into eschatology, but it's hard not to read this. And immediately after this happens, Jesus says, then you're going to see the Son of Man coming in glory. Many people think that's already happened because of the destruction of Jerusalem. There's Tina back there, and she's just studied all this eschatology and postmillennialism. The postmillennialists are the ones who say, this has already happened. It's all done. So, anyway, I think it is the most famous fall of Jerusalem for many reasons. It was very thorough, and what's left today, people go to the Wailing Wall, which is what little bit is left of the Temple Mount. The Jews go there, Christians go there, but again, it's the ruins of what the Romans did in 70 A.D. All right. What now? 66. Yeah, but the question is, it ends at 66 A.D. When does it begin? I knew it ends at 66 A.D. because that's Florus. When does it begin? Begins at creation. Okay, so it begins at creation. I couldn't tell, and that was the question that we had. Did it start with Abraham, or did it start at creation? But it starts at creation. Okay, good. It's a worthwhile read. It really is. All right, any other questions or comments? Thank you, Tina. Again, I've done a thorough job. All right, well, if not, I want to thank you all, and next week we'll be looking at the fall of Jerusalem. Can it fall again? Well, yes, it can. And this time is actually even worse in some ways. It can't be worse for the temple and for the destruction of the structures, but for the people, the fall of Jerusalem in 135 is decisive. It's decisive. All right, we'll look at that next week. Thank you.